The courtroom was quiet, too quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the heavy kind. The kind that settles in your chest like a stone when everyone's holding their breath. It was a Tuesday morning in late September. The kind of day where the Georgia sun hadn't quite burned off the morning haze, and the air still clung to the last whispers of summer. Inside the county courthouse in downtown Atlanta, the wood-paneled walls and high ceilings gave the room a sense of history, of weight. Portraits of past judges, mostly white men in stiff collars, stared down from their frames as if keeping watch over the proceedings below. At the bench sat a black man in a black robe. He wasn't tall, but he carried himself like someone who'd spent a lifetime earning every inch of space he occupied. His eyes were calm, his voice steady, and his rulings sharp. He'd been on the bench for nearly a decade now, and though he'd faced skepticism early on, some folks still couldn't picture a black man as a judge unless he was on TV. He'd long since proven himself through fairness, precision, and an almost unnerving patience. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The gavel in his hand was more symbol than tool. Respect was usually enough. Today's case was supposed to be routine, a civil dispute over a shared driveway between two neighbors. Nothing flashy, nothing dramatic. Just property lines, survey maps, and a little neighborly resentment that had festered into legal paperwork. The plaintiff, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes and neatly braided hair, sat at her table clutching a folder like it might shield her from what was coming. She'd hired a lawyer, a young man with wire-rimmed glasses who kept adjusting his tie like it was strangling him. The other side? No lawyer. Just a man in his late 40s wearing a wrinkled polo shirt and jeans that looked like they'd seen better days. He'd insisted on representing himself, which wasn't uncommon, but he'd done it with a kind of swagger that made the bailiff raise an eyebrow the moment he walked in. He'd strutted past the metal detector like he owned the place, cracking jokes with the security guard. Jokes that weren't quite funny, just loud. His name wasn't important right now. What mattered was how he carried himself. Like the rules didn't apply to him, like this whole courtroom was just another stage. The hearing began normally enough. The judge asked the plaintiff's attorney to present his argument. The lawyer stood, cleared his throat, and laid out the facts. Shared driveway, agreed upon maintenance, sudden refusal by the other party to contribute, then threats, then a fence built overnight right down the middle. Photos were entered into evidence. Surveyor reports were cited. The judge listened, nodding occasionally, taking notes in neat, deliberate script. Then it was the other man's turn. He stood up fast, knocking his chair back with a scrape that made several people flinch. "Your Honor," he began, but there was no real honor in his tone, more like impatience wrapped in fake politeness. He waved a hand dismissively at the photos. "This is all nonsense. That driveway's been there since my granddaddy's time. She's just mad because I finally put up a fence to keep her dog out of my yard. You think I'm going to pay for her poodle's personal highway?" A few people in the gallery shifted. The judge didn't react. He simply said, "The issue before the court isn't about dogs, sir. It's about an easement recorded in 1987 that grants both parties shared access. Your unilateral construction of a barrier may constitute trespass." The man's face flushed. "Easement? What's that, some fancy word you picked up at law school?" "Look, I don't need some piece of paper telling me what I can do on my own land." The judge leaned forward slightly. "You're in a court of law. The piece of paper you're dismissing is a legally binding agreement signed by your predecessor in title. It's not optional." That's when the man's tone changed. Not louder, but colder. He narrowed his eyes, looked the judge up and down, not at his face, but at his robe, his hands, his skin. And then he smirked. "You know what? You're real good at this act. Real convincing. Like one of those performers at that comedy club downtown. What's it called? The Laugh Factory? Yeah. You got the outfit, the voice, the whole bit. Your Honor this, the court that." He chuckled, low and mocking. "Man, you had me going for a second. Thought you were the real deal." The room froze. It wasn't just the words. It was the way he said them, the implication hanging in the air like smoke. That a black man in a judge's robe couldn't possibly be legitimate. That he must be playing a role. That his authority was a costume. The plaintiff's lawyer dropped his pen. The bailiff took a half step forward, hand resting lightly on his belt. Even the court reporter paused, fingers hovering over the keys. The only sound was the soft hum of the air conditioning fighting the Georgia heat. The judge didn't move. didn't blink. He just sat there, his expression unreadable. But if you looked closely, if you'd spend enough time watching him, you'd see the slight tightening around his jaw, the way his knuckles whitened where they gripped the edge of the bench. He'd heard this kind of thing before, of course. Not always out loud, not always so brazen, but the message was always the same. You don't belong here. He'd been called boy by a defendant once, years ago. He'd had clerks forget to bring him files until he asked 3 times. He'd walked into judges' conferences and been mistaken for the caterer. Each time he'd swallowed it. Not because he agreed, but because the robe demanded restraint. Because the law required impartiality. Because if he reacted, really reacted, they'd say he was emotional, angry, too sensitive. They'd use it against him, against every black judge who came after. But this was different. This wasn't a whisper in a hallway. This was in open court, on the record, in front of witnesses. And it wasn't just disrespectful, it was dangerous. It undermined the very foundation of the judicial system. If people could stand in a courtroom and laugh at the judge's legitimacy based on the color of his skin, then what was left? What stopped anyone from ignoring rulings they didn't like? Still, he said nothing. Not yet. He turned to the plaintiff's attorney. Counsel, please proceed with your rebuttal. The lawyer, visibly shaken, stammered through the rest of his points, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. The man in the polo shirt sat back down, arms crossed, looking smug like he'd won something, like he'd exposed a secret. When the hearing ended, temporarily adjourned for the judge to review a zoning ordinance, the man stood up and stretched, as if he'd just finished a light workout. He winked at someone in the back row, then turned to leave. But before he reached the door, the judge spoke. Sir. The man stopped, turned slowly. You will remain in the courtroom until I dismiss you. There was no anger in the voice, just steel. The man hesitated, then shrugged and sat back down, muttering something under his breath that sounded like whatever. The judge gathered his papers, stood and walked out through the side door to his chambers, but he didn't sit down. He stood by the window looking out at the city skyline, the glass towers, the old brick buildings, the distant hum of traffic. His reflection stared back at him in the glass, robe, gavel, title, all the symbols of authority, and yet in that man's eyes none of it mattered. All he saw was a stereotype, a caricature, a funny performer. He thought about his father, who'd worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on, who'd told him, son, you'll have to be twice as good to get half as far. He thought about his mother, who'd ironed his school shirts every night, whispering, hold your head high, no matter what they say. He thought about the law school professor who'd pulled him aside after class and said, they'll test you harder, watch you closer, doubt you longer. Don't give them a reason, but don't shrink yourself either. He took a deep breath, let it out slow. This wasn't just about him. It was about the woman in the courtroom who'd been too afraid to speak up. It was about every young black kid who'd ever been told they couldn't be a doctor, a scientist, a judge. It was about the idea that justice should look the same for everyone, no matter who's wearing the robe. He walked back into the courtroom. The man was still there, scrolling on his phone, looking bored. The judge didn't sit. He stood at the bench, hands resting on the wood. Before we adjourn, he said, voice calm but carrying, I want to address something that occurred during today's proceedings. The man looked up, confused. You made a comment, the judge continued, suggesting that my role in this courtroom is performative, that I am, in your words, a funny performer. The man opened his mouth to protest, but the judge raised a hand just slightly, and he fell silent. That remark, the judge said, was not only disrespectful to this court, but it carried a racial undertone that cannot be ignored. In this country, black men have long been reduced to entertainers, caricatures, sidekicks, never the authority figure, never the one in charge. Your comment, whether intentional or not, echoed that painful history. He paused. Let the words settle. This courtroom is a place of dignity, of law, of equal standing under the Constitution. When you mock the judge's legitimacy based on appearance, you don't just insult me. You insult the system we all rely on. You suggest that justice is a costume, not a commitment. The man shifted in his seat. His smugness had faded. Now he just looked uncomfortable. The judge didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. This matter will be addressed at our next hearing, he said. Until then, consider your words carefully. Because in this room, words have consequences, he gavelled once. Sharp, Final. Court is adjourned. As people filed out, the plaintiff lingered for a moment. She looked up at the bench, met the judge's eyes, and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't gratitude. It was recognition. Solidarity. The judge returned to his chambers. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt tired, but also clear. Whatever came next, criticism, backlash, headlines, he knew he couldn't let that comment slide. Not this time, not here. Because if the judge himself isn't respected, then what hope is there for justice? And somewhere in the courthouse hallway, the man in the polo shirt walked out into the sunlight, still muttering to himself, unaware that his careless words had just set something in motion, something far bigger than a driveway dispute, far deeper than a courtroom insult. Something that would force him, and maybe others, to see what they'd been blind to all along. That night, long after the courthouse emptied and the street lights flickered on outside, the judge sat alone in his chambers. The city hummed below, cars, distant sirens, the occasional laugh from a late-night diner. But inside it was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that lets your thoughts get loud. He hadn't gone home. Not yet. Something about that man's words kept circling in his head like a bird that couldn't find a place to land. Funny performer. It wasn't the first time someone had questioned his place, but it was the first time it happened right there, in his own courtroom, in front of witnesses, as if his authority was just part of a show. And the worst part? He knew exactly what the man meant. Not because it was said outright, but because he'd lived it his whole life. He leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. The robe was still on, though he'd unbuttoned the top. His tie was loose. He rubbed his temples, trying to push away the weight pressing behind his eyes. Then, almost without thinking, he reached into the bottom drawer of his desk and pulled out an old photo album. Leather-bound, edges worn soft from years of handling. He flipped it open. The first page held a black and white picture of a small house with a sagging porch and a tire swing hanging from an oak tree. His childhood home, Birmingham, Alabama, 1978. He was maybe 6 years old, standing barefoot in the yard, wearing overalls 2 sizes too big, grinning like he didn't have a care in the world. But even then, he'd learned to watch his step. His grandfather had taught him that early. Son, you smile when you're safe. You watch when you're not. His grandfather had been a janitor at the local courthouse, not the fancy one downtown, but the old county building with peeling paint and flickering fluorescents. Every night after school, he'd walk there to wait for his ride home, and his grandfather would let him sit in the empty jury box while he mopped the floors. This is where justice lives, the old man would say, sweeping slowly, deliberately. Even when it's quiet, it's working. Back then, the judge didn't understand. He just liked the echo of his voice in the big room, the way the wood benches felt cool under his legs. But later, when he was older, he realized his grandfather wasn't just cleaning floors, he was claiming space. In a place that had once denied black people the right to testify against white ones, his grandfather showed up every night with a mop and a bucket saying, "I belong here too." He turned the page. A photo from high school, him in a cap and gown, standing next to a white teacher who'd pushed him to apply to colleges no one in his neighborhood had ever heard of. "You've got a mind for law," she'd told him once after he argued a point in debate club so fiercely the whole room went silent. Don't waste it. He hadn't. He'd studied late into the night under a dim lamp, worked weekends at a grocery store to help pay bills, and walked 3 miles to the public library every Saturday because his school didn't have enough books. He got into a good college on a scholarship, then law school on grit and grace, but even there he felt like an outsider. Not because he wasn't smart, he knew he was, but because people looked at him and saw something else. A diversity hire, a quota, never just a lawyer. He remembered his first job interview at a big firm. The senior partner had leaned back in his leather chair, smiled politely and said, "You're impressive, but are you sure you'd be comfortable here? Our clients, well, they're used to a certain type." He'd forced a smile, said all the right things, got the job anyway, but he never forgot that look, the one that said, "You don't quite fit." Now, decades later, sitting in his own courtroom, wearing the robe he'd earned through years of sacrifice, he still carried that feeling. Not insecurity, never that, but awareness. The kind that comes from knowing you're always being watched a little more closely, judged a little more harshly, expected to be perfect just to be seen as equal. He closed the album and set it aside. Then he pulled out the court transcript from today's hearing. He read the line again. "You're not a real judge, you're just some funny performer playing dress-up." The words sat on the page like stains. He thought about letting it go. Judges were supposed to rise above personal slights, stay neutral, keep the peace, and part of him wanted to do just that. Dismiss it as the rant of a frustrated man, move on with the case, keep the courtroom running like a well-oiled machine. But another part of him, the part that remembered his grandfather mopping those floors, the part that had walked 3 miles for a book, the part that had sat through meetings where people talked over him until he raised his voice just to be heard, knew that ignoring it would send a message too. A message that this kind of disrespect was acceptable, that the dignity of the court didn't extend to everyone equally. He stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the city lights shimmered like stars trapped on earth. He thought about the woman in the courtroom, the plaintiff. She'd said nothing when the comment was made. Just looked down, tightened her grip on her folder. He knew why. She'd been taught, like so many others, that speaking up could make things worse, that staying quiet was safer. But silence had a cost. It let lies grow. It let prejudice fester. And in a place like this, a courthouse where people came hoping for fairness, it couldn't be allowed to stand. He turned back to his desk, opened a legal pad, began to write not an angry note, not a personal vendetta, but a plan, a response that wasn't just punishment but purpose, something that might actually make the man understand, not just that he'd broken a rule, but why his words hurt, why they mattered. Because the truth was, this wasn't really about one rude comment. It was about centuries of being told black people were entertainers, not leaders, jesters, not judges, sidekicks, not decision-makers, minstrel shows, not courtrooms. That history didn't vanish because someone put on a robe. It lingered in glances, in assumptions, in careless words spoken without thinking. And maybe, just maybe, this moment could be a chance to break that cycle. Not with shame, but with understanding. Not with revenge, but with education. He thought about the local university down the street. They had a continuing education program, courses on civil rights history, on systemic bias, on the long road to equality in America. What if, instead of just slapping a fine or a few days in jail, punishments that would be forgotten by next week, the man had to actually learn? Had to sit with the truth of what his words echoed? It was unconventional, maybe even risky. Some would call it overreach. But the law gave judges wide discretion in contempt cases, especially direct contempt. Disrespect that happens right in front of them. And if the goal of justice was not just to punish, but to correct, to teach, to heal, then why not try something different? He spent the next hour drafting notes. Not a sentence yet, just ideas, structure, requirements. He wanted it to be serious, not symbolic. 40 hours of coursework, a written reflection, supervised by a certified instructor. No shortcuts. No way out unless he truly engaged. He also knew it would cause a stir. People would talk. Some would praise it. Others would accuse him of playing politics from the bench. But he'd faced criticism before. He could handle it. What mattered was whether it might actually change something, even just in one person. He finally stood, stretched, and took off his robe. Folded it carefully over the back of his chair. He'd go home now. His wife would be waiting, probably with a plate of food covered in foil and a look that said, "You worked too late again." And she'd be right. But she'd also listen. She always did. As he locked up his office and walked down the empty hallway, his footsteps echoing against the marble floor, he felt something shift inside him. Not anger, not fear. Resolve. Calm, steady resolve. Tomorrow, he'd call the clerk, set the next hearing date, prepare his ruling, and when the man walked back into that courtroom, smug or sorry or somewhere in between, he'd hear something he didn't expect. Not just a reprimand, but an invitation. A chance to see the world through eyes he'd never bothered to open. Because justice wasn't just about who was right or wrong in a property dispute. It was about who got to be seen as human, as worthy, as real. And in that moment, walking out into the warm Georgia night, the judge knew he couldn't let that go unanswered. Not this time, not ever again. Back at home, he poured a glass of water and sat on the porch. The crickets were singing. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked. Normal sounds. Peaceful sounds. But his mind was already on tomorrow. On the weight of the gavel, on the power of words, both the hurtful ones and the healing ones, he thought about his grandfather again. Wondered if the old man could see him now, wearing the robe, holding the bench. Standing firm, I'm still claiming space, he whispered into the dark. Just like you taught me. And for the first time all day, he felt at peace. Not because the problem was solved, but because he'd chosen to face it, not with bitterness, but with purpose. Not as a victim, but as a guardian of something bigger than himself. The law wasn't perfect. The system wasn't flawless. But as long as he sat in that chair, he'd make sure it tried to be fair. For everyone, even for the man who called him a performer, especially for him. The morning sun poured through the tall courthouse windows, casting long rectangles of light across the polished floor. The air smelled faintly of coffee and old paper, the usual courthouse perfume. Outside, the city buzzed with its usual rhythm, buses groaning to stops, people rushing to work, pigeons squabbling over crumbs. But inside courtroom 3B, the mood was different, tense, expectant, like the air before a storm breaks. People had been whispering about it all week. Word had spread fast after the last hearing. A man had insulted the judge, called him a funny performer, and now everyone wanted to see what would happen next. Reporters lingered near the back, notepad in hand. A few law students from the nearby university sat in the gallery, eyes wide. Even some of the other judges had stopped by, pretending to check the docket board but really just waiting to see how this would play out. The man in the polo shirt arrived 10 minutes late, same as last time. He walked in like he owned the place, though his swagger seemed a little forced this time. Maybe it was the way the bailiff watched him a little too closely. Maybe it was the silence that fell over the room the second he stepped inside. He didn't crack a joke this time. Didn't wink at anyone. He just sat down, crossed his arms, and stared straight ahead, like he was daring the world to say something. The plaintiff was already there, sitting quietly with her lawyer. She looked tired but calm. She'd heard the rumors, too, that the judge might throw the book at him. Part of her hoped he would. But another part, the part that had lived long enough to know how messy justice could be, just wanted it to be over. Then the side door opened. The judge entered slowly, deliberately. No rush, no show. Just the soft click of his shoes on the floor, the whisper of his robe. He didn't look at the man right away. He took his seat, adjusted his glasses, and scanned the room with that quiet authority that needed no volume to be felt. All rise, the bailiff said. Everyone stood, even the man in the polo shirt, though he did it with a sigh like it was a chore. The judge nodded. Be seated. He didn't start with the case, not yet. He placed his hands flat on the bench and looked directly at the man. Before we continue with the matter of the shared driveway, he began, his voice calm but clear, I must address the contempt of court that occurred during our last session. A few people shifted in their seats. The man stiffened. You made a statement in open court, the judge continued, that questioned not only my role, but my legitimacy as a judicial officer, using language that carried a clear racial undertone. You referred to me as a funny performer. That remark was not only disrespectful to this court, it undermined the very foundation of our legal system, which depends on mutual respect and the presumption that those who wear this robe do so with integrity, experience, and the full authority of the law. The man opened his mouth, but the judge held up a single finger, just enough to stop him without seeming harsh. I'm not here to debate your opinion, the judge said, but I am here to uphold the dignity of this institution. And when someone uses racially coded language to dismiss a judge's authority, it's not just a personal insult. It's a threat to equal justice, he paused. Let that sink in. Under Georgia law, I have the power to hold you in direct contempt. That usually means a fine or a short jail sentence, sometimes both. But punishment alone doesn't always lead to understanding, and in this case, I believe understanding is what's missing. Now he leaned forward slightly, not aggressive, just present. So here is what I order. He took a breath. You will complete a 40-hour educational program on African American history, the civil rights movement, and the impact of racial bias in American institutions. This program must be certified by the Continuing Education Department at the local university. You will attend all sessions, participate in discussions, and submit a written reflection no less than 1,500 words on what you've learned and how your previous comment reflects a deeper pattern of dehumanization that has harmed this country for generations. The room went completely still. Even the clock on the wall seemed to hold its breath. The man blinked. You're making me take a class? Yes, the judge said simply. On Black history? Yes. Because I called you a performer? Because your words echoed a long and painful history in which Black people were reduced to entertainers, minstrel shows, caricatures, sidekicks, never seen as serious, capable, or authoritative. That history isn't just in the past. It lives in comments like yours. And if you're going to stand in a courtroom and challenge the legitimacy of a judge based on appearance, you need to understand why that cuts so deep. The man looked around, like he expected someone to laugh, to say this was a joke. But no one did. The reporters were scribbling furiously. The law students were leaning forward. The plaintiff was watching him with quiet eyes. What if I don't do it? He asked, voice tighter now. Then you will serve 30 days in the county jail for contempt of court, the judge replied. No probation, no early release, 30 days. He let that hang in the air for a moment. This isn't about shaming you, he added, softer now. It's about giving you a chance to see what you've been blind to. Education isn't punishment, it's an opportunity. And I'm giving you that opportunity. He turned to the clerk. Please provide Mr. Hargrove with the program details and enrollment instructions before he leaves today. Then, without another word about it, he turned back to the case file. Now, regarding the easement dispute, the rest of the hearing was almost an afterthought. Motions were reviewed. Dates were set. But no one was really listening. The real moment had already happened. When court adjourned, the man didn't leave right away. He sat there staring at the floor, his earlier bravado gone. One of the bailiffs handed him a printed sheet. Course title, schedule, contact info. He took it slowly, like it might burn his fingers. Outside, the reporters swarmed, microphones thrust forward. Sir, what do you think of the judge's order? Do you feel this is fair? Will you comply? He didn't answer. Just shoved the paper in his pocket and walked away, head down. But inside the courthouse, something had shifted. Later that afternoon, the judge sat in his chambers sipping lukewarm coffee. He knew what was coming. The headlines. The hot takes. The phone calls from concerned colleagues. Maybe even a formal complaint. But he also knew he'd done the right thing. Not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. He thought about the reflection essay he'd required. He didn't expect poetry. He didn't need an apology. What he hoped for, what he truly hoped for, was honesty. That the man would sit in that classroom, hear stories about Emmett Till, about the Tuskegee experiments, about Black lawyers being turned away from courthouses not 50 years ago, and finally understand that calling a Black judge a performer wasn't just rude. It was part of a much larger story of erasure. He remembered his first year on the bench. An older white attorney had called him son during a hearing. He'd corrected him politely. The man had laughed it off. Sorry, Judge, force of habit. But the message was clear. I still see you as less than me. This was different. This was public. This was recorded. And that meant it couldn't be brushed aside as just a slip. Now, instead of letting it fester, he'd turned it into a teaching moment. Not just for the man, but for everyone watching. Because justice shouldn't just punish. It should awaken. That evening, news outlets picked up the story. Local TV ran a segment. Judge orders racist remark to be answered with education, not jail. Online, the comments poured in. Some furious, some supportive, most confused. Is this legal? One asked. Since when do judges assign homework? Another joked. But a civil rights professor from the university called the courthouse the next morning. I want to help, she said. We'll design the course ourselves. Make it meaningful. Not just dates and names, but the human cost of bias. The judge agreed. And just like that, what started as an insult became something else entirely. A bridge. Meanwhile, the man went home and tossed the paper on his kitchen table. He didn't touch it for 2 days. He told his buddies at the auto shop it was ridiculous, said he'd rather do the jail time. But then his daughter, 16, sharp-eyed, raised on social media and school lessons about equity, found the paper. Dad, she said, holding it up. You really said that? He tried to wave it off. It was just a joke. It didn't sound like a joke on the news, she said quietly. And Judge Williams looked hurt. He hadn't thought about that. Hurt. He'd been so focused on his own frustration over the driveway, his own sense of being pushed around, that he hadn't considered how his words landed. But now, seeing his daughter's face, disappointed, not angry, he felt a crack open inside him. Maybe he'd been wrong, not just legally wrong. Humanly wrong. He didn't enroll that day. But he didn't throw the paper away either. He left it on the table, and every morning he saw it. A quiet reminder that sometimes the hardest thing to face isn't punishment, but the truth. Back at the courthouse, the judge heard about the media frenzy but refused all interview requests. The ruling speaks for itself, he told his clerk. And in a way it did, because for the first time in a long time, a courtroom wasn't just a place of judgment, it was a place of possibility. And as he locked up his office that night, he allowed himself a small, tired smile. Not because he'd won, but because he'd planted a seed. And sometimes that's all you can do. The rest was up to the man, and whether he was willing to let it grow. The story exploded faster than anyone expected. By the next morning, it wasn't just local news, it was everywhere. Cable news channels debated it over dramatic music. Social media lit up with hot takes, memes, and outrage from every direction. One headline read, "Judge forces man to take woke." Classes after racist remark, another said. Courthouse becomes classroom, a bold move for justice. Talk radio hosts called it judicial overreach. Civil rights groups called it a masterclass in restorative justice. At first, the judge didn't pay much attention. He turned off his phone notifications, ignored the voicemails piling up at the courthouse, and focused on his docket. But you couldn't escape it completely. Even the barista at his usual coffee spot gave him a knowing look and said, "Heard you're making people do homework now." He just smiled and said, "Only when they skip class the first time." But outside his quiet routine, the world was reacting loudly. On one side, critics were furious. A conservative legal group filed a formal complaint with the State Judicial Conduct Board, claiming the judge had abused his power, violated the man's free speech, and imposed a political agenda from the bench. Online comment sections filled with angry voices. Since when do judges get to assign history lessons? This is why people don't trust the courts anymore. Some even dug up old rulings of his, twisting them out of context to paint him as biased. One viral post showed a doctored image of him in a graduation cap, handing out diplomas like a professor, not a judge. The caption read, "Next up, mandatory yoga and vegan cooking for traffic violators." It stung, not because it was true, but because it twisted his intention into something silly, something performative, exactly the kind of thing he'd been accused of in the first place. But then, something unexpected happened. Other voices rose up, calmer, clearer, rooted in experience. A retired federal judge wrote an op-ed in the local paper. "Judges have always had discretion in contempt cases. What's unusual here isn't the punishment, it's the humanity." A law professor pointed out that courts routinely order anger management, parenting classes, or substance abuse counseling as part of sentencing. "Why is education on racial history any different?" she asked. Especially when the offense was rooted in ignorance. Even more powerful were the messages that started arriving at the courthouse, not through official channels, but in handwritten letters left at the front desk or mailed in plain envelopes. One came from a black high school teacher. "Thank you for showing my students that dignity can be defended without losing your own." Another from a white grandmother in rural Georgia. "My grandson said something similar once out of ignorance, not hate. I wish someone had given him a chance to learn instead of just scold him." The judge read each one. He didn't respond, but he kept them in a folder in his desk. They reminded him he wasn't alone. Meanwhile, the man at the center of it all was struggling. He'd gone back and forth for days. Part of him wanted to dig in, refuse the course, serve the jail time, and become a martyr for free speech. His brother egged him on. "Don't let them push you around. You didn't mean anything by it." But then his daughter stopped talking to him. Not yelling, just silence. She'd leave the house before he woke up, come home after he went to bed. When he finally cornered her, she said quietly, "I'm embarrassed, Dad, not because of the news, because you didn't even realize why it was wrong." That hit harder than any fine. So one rainy Thursday afternoon, he drove to the university. He didn't tell anyone, just parked his truck, walked into the continuing education building and asked for the program coordinator. She was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair. She didn't smirk, didn't judge, just handed him a syllabus and said, "First class is Monday at 6. Don't be late." The course wasn't what he expected. He thought it would be lectures full of blame, finger-pointing, guilt trips. But it wasn't like that at all. The first session was about storytelling, real people sharing real experiences. A retired postal worker talked about being denied a home loan in the 1960s because of redlining. A young woman described being followed in stores as a teenager. A veteran spoke about serving overseas only to come home and be told he couldn't eat at the same lunch counter as white soldiers. No one shouted. No one called him a racist. They just told their truth, and for the first time, he listened. He learned about the Tuskegee syphilis study, how black men were lied to, left untreated, all in the name of science. He read about the Scottsboro Boys, 9 teenagers falsely accused of rape in the 1930s, nearly executed because no one believed black testimony over white. He watched footage of peaceful marchers being beaten on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, their blood staining the pavement while the nation watched. It wasn't abstract history. It was human, painful, real. One night after class, he stayed behind. The instructor was packing up her notes. "Can I ask you something?" he said, voice low. She nodded. Why did the judge make me do this? Why not just fine me or lock me up?" She looked at him for a long moment. "Because jail would have taught you to hate him. This might teach you to understand him." He didn't say anything, just nodded and walked out into the cool night air. Back home, he started writing his reflection essay, not because he had to, but because he needed to. He wrote about his grandfather, who'd worked in a factory his whole life and always said, "Keep your head down, work hard, and don't make waves." He wrote about how that advice had shaped him, how he'd learned to see authority as something distant, something that didn't include people who looked like him. Or in this case, people who didn't look like him. He admitted he'd never thought about how calling someone a performer could echo centuries of black people being forced to entertain white audiences just to survive. He wrote that he hadn't meant to be cruel, but that intent didn't erase impact. It wasn't perfect. It was raw, awkward in places, full of crossed-out lines and second guesses, but it was honest. As the weeks passed, the media storm began to quiet. The initial outrage faded when people realized the man was actually showing up, actually doing the work. A local reporter even attended one of the public sessions with permission and wrote a follow-up piece. From Contempt to Classroom, One Man's Unexpected Journey. The story shifted. It wasn't just about a judge's unusual sentence anymore. It was about change, about the possibility that people can grow, even when they start from a place of ignorance. Of course, not everyone was convinced. Online trolls still called it forced re-education. A few politicians used it as a talking point in campaign speeches. But something had changed in the public conversation. More people were asking, what if punishment isn't the only answer? What if learning matters too? Legal scholars began citing the case in journals. A few other judges quietly reached out to the courthouse, asking how they could implement similar programs in their own jurisdictions. For hate speech, for bias-motivated offenses, even for repeat offenders who needed more than just jail time. The judge never took credit. He simply said, "The law gives us tools. Sometimes the right tool isn't a hammer, it's a key." At home, his wife finally stopped giving him that worried look every time he came in late. "You did the right thing," she told him one night over dinner. Even when it was hard, he just squeezed her hand. No words needed, and through it all, the man kept going to class. He missed one session because his truck broke down, but he called ahead and made it up. He asked questions, real ones, not defensive ones. He even stayed after one night to help clean up chairs. No one patted him on the back. No one forgave him on the spot. But something quieter happened, respect. Not because he was perfect, but because he was trying. One evening, as he walked out of the university building, he saw a group of students gathered around a mural on the wall. A painting of civil rights leaders, hands linked, faces determined. He stood there for a long time just looking. Then he pulled out his phone and texted his daughter, "Can we talk?" "I think I finally get it," she replied 5 minutes later. "I'll be home by 7. That small exchange meant more to him than any courtroom victory ever could. Back at the courthouse, the judge prepared for the next hearing, the one where the man would return with his completed essay. He didn't know what to expect. Would he be resentful? Defensive? Or would something have shifted? He didn't hope for a grand apology. He didn't need one. What he hoped for was awareness, that the man would walk out of that courtroom seeing the world and himself just a little differently. Because in the end, justice wasn't just about who won or lost a case. It was about whether people left the room more human than when they entered. And as the days ticked down to the hearing, the judge allowed himself to believe just a little that maybe this time they both would. The morning of the final hearing was unseasonably cool for Atlanta. Crisp air, clear sky, the kind of day that makes you believe in fresh starts. People arrived at the courthouse earlier than usual, not just lawyers and clerks, but curious onlookers, a few students from the university program, even the woman who'd been the plaintiff in the original driveway case. She came alone this time, no attorney, just a quiet presence in the back row, her hands folded in her lap like she was holding on to hope. The man in the polo shirt, though today he wore a button-down, slightly wrinkled but clean, walked in 10 minutes before the session began. He didn't swagger, didn't mutter. He carried a manila folder under his arm, its edges worn from being opened and closed too many times. Inside was his essay, printed on plain white paper, signed at the bottom in careful handwriting. He sat in the same seat as before, but everything about him was different. His shoulders weren't hunched in defiance. His eyes didn't dart around like he was looking for an escape. He just sat there, waiting like someone who finally understood the weight of where he was. When the judge entered, there was no dramatic pause, no heavy silence. Just the usual rustle of people rising, the soft thud of the gavel and the calm command to be seated. But everyone could feel it. The air had changed. This wasn't about punishment anymore. It was about something else, something harder to name. The judge didn't waste time. He nodded to the clerk, who handed him the man's completed coursework certificate and the essay. The judge read it slowly, turning each page with care. The courtroom stayed quiet. Even the clock seemed to tick softer. When he finished, he looked up. "Thank you for completing the program," he said, his voice steady but not cold. "And for submitting your reflection." The man nodded, throat tight. He didn't trust himself to speak yet. The judge set the papers down. "Would you like to say anything before I rule on the contempt matter?" The man took a breath, looked down at his hands, then up at the bench. I didn't get it before," he began, voice rough. "I thought I was just frustrated about my property." "I thought calling you that." "It was just words. A joke even. But I see now it wasn't just words. It was part of something bigger. Something ugly." He paused, swallowed hard. "In that class, I heard stories. Real people. Things I never learned in school. Things I never thought about. Like how for so long, black folks couldn't even testify in court against white people. Or how judges like you, smart, fair, qualified, were told you didn't belong here just because of your skin." His voice cracked, but he kept going. "I called you a performer like it was nothing. But that word? It's got a history. Minstrel shows, blackface, people laughing at black pain like it was entertainment. And me saying that in a courtroom, where you're supposed to be the symbol of fairness, it wasn't just disrespectful. It was as cruel. Even if I didn't mean it that way." He looked down again, then back up, eyes glistening. "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm just saying, I see it now. And I'm sorry." The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. No one moved. No one whispered. Even the reporters kept their pens still for a moment. The judge didn't smile. But something in his eyes softened, just a little. "Thank you for your honesty," he said. "That took courage." He leaned forward slightly, hands resting on the bench. "What you've done, completing the program, reflecting on your words, showing up here today, that matters. Not because it erases what was said, but because it shows a willingness to grow. And in a world that often chooses punishment over understanding, that willingness is rare." He paused, then continued. "The court finds that you have fulfilled the conditions imposed for contempt. Therefore, the matter is closed. No fines, no jail time. You are free to go." A soft sigh moved through the room. Relief. Not just for the man, but for everyone watching. It felt like something had been mended. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. The man stood slowly. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said, and this time the words carried real weight. As he turned to leave, he stopped near the plaintiff's seat. She looked up at him, surprised. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, just to her. "For everything. The fence, the threats, and for what I said in here. It must have been hard to hear." She studied him for a long moment, then gave a small nod. "Thank you," she said simply. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was a start. Outside, the sun was high. The man walked down the courthouse steps, not in a hurry, just breathing. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from his daughter. "Proud of you, Dad." He smiled, really smiled, for the first time in weeks. Back inside, the judge closed the file on the contempt matter. But he didn't move right away. He sat there looking out at the emptying courtroom. The wood, the flags, the portraits on the wall, they all felt different now. Not just symbols of power, but spaces where change could happen. In the weeks that followed, the story didn't disappear. It transformed. News outlets ran follow-ups, not with outrage, but with curiosity. "Can education replace punishment?" one headline asked. Law schools invited the judge to speak, not as a controversial figure, but as someone reimagining what justice could look like. He always said the same thing. "I didn't invent anything new. I just remembered that the law is meant to heal, not just punish." The university expanded the program. What started as a one-time requirement became a standing option for certain contempt cases involving bias or hate speech. Other counties reached out asking how they could adapt it. Even a few federal judges took note. But the real change wasn't in policy. It was in people. The man went back to his neighborhood. He didn't tear down the fence right away, but he knocked on his neighbor's door. They talked, really talked, for the first time in years. Eventually, they agreed to share the driveway again, with a new agreement drawn up fairly, respectfully. No lawyers needed. He also started volunteering at the community center, helping teens with homework. Not because he had to, but because he finally understood that belonging wasn't about property lines. It was about how you treated people. As for the judge, he kept doing his job. Same early morning, same careful ruling, same quiet dignity. But something had shifted in him too. He'd spent so much of his life proving he belonged in that robe that he'd almost forgotten the robe wasn't the point. The point was the people who came before him. Hurting, confused, angry, hopeful. And whether he could leave them a little better than he found them. One evening, months later, he received a package with no return address. Inside was a framed photo, black and white, old but carefully preserved. It showed a young man in a janitor's uniform, standing proudly in front of a courthouse, mop in hand. On the back, in neat script, it read, "For the judge who claimed the space my father cleaned." He didn't know who sent it. Maybe someone who remembered his grandfather. Maybe someone who just believed in the story. Either way, he hung it in his chambers right next to his law degree. It reminded him that justice wasn't built in a day. It was built by janitors who showed up, by students who walked miles for books, by judges who chose understanding over anger, and by men who finally listened. Years later, when people asked about that case, the one with the funny performer comment, they didn't talk about the insult. They talked about what came after. The class, the essay, the apology, the quiet moment between two neighbors who'd once been enemies. Because in the end, the most powerful thing a courtroom can do isn't just to decide who's right or wrong. It's to show that people can change, that dignity can be restored, that even the deepest wounds can begin to heal, if someone's willing to listen, to learn, and to say, "I see you now." And on the bench in that same courtroom, the judge kept showing up, not as a symbol, not as a performer, but as a human being doing his best to make justice feel real for everyone who walked through those doors. The gavel still fell. The ruling still stood. But now there was something else in the air, something warm, steady, and full of possibility. Hope. Not loud. Not flashy. Just there. Like sunlight through a courthouse window waiting for someone to step into it.